This is the Almost Timely newsletter for the week of May 12th, 2024. Content authenticity statement 90% of this week's newsletter was generated by me, the human. There are multiple outputs in the opening section from different generative AI models. There's a link at the top of the newsletter for why this kind of disclosure is important and why it might be required for anyone doing business in any capacity with the EU in the near future. Before we get to the newsletter, slightly shorter this week because I am about to get on a plane for 20-ish some hours to go to Melbourne, Australia to speak at the Australian Food and Grocery Council. And so I don't have the latest and greatest news for the week. So we're going to cover the big thing, which was the OpenAI model spec. But the newsletter is a little bit shorter this week as a result. So what's on my mind this week? AI ethics and the OpenAI model spec. This week, OpenAI released its model spec, which is a guide for how they think generative AI models should work. This has understandably provoked a lot of discussion and healthy discussion at that. I figured we should take a quick tour together of the model spec and add to the discussion where relevant. Before we do that, though, we should talk about ethics, AI ethics in particular. If we don't have a handle on the topic, chances are we're not going to make the most out of the model spec. So, what is ethics? That is an awfully large question. The basic dictionary definition is that ethics is a branch of philosophy that studies behavior and moral judgments. For fun, I did some asking around. Let's see what the different models had to say. Gemini said, ethics is a study of what constitutes right and wrong behavior. Claude 3 Opus said, ethics is the branch of philosophy that deals with moral principles and values and how they guide human behavior. It involves systematically examining and evaluating concepts of right and wrong, good and bad, in order to determine what actions are morally justified or prohibited. Mixtral, the 8x22 model, said ethics is the branch of philosophy that deals with moral principles and values and how they guide human behavior. Actually, this is almost identical to Claude 3 Opus. Interesting. Llama 3, the 70 billion model, said ethics is the principles and values that guide human behavior, decision making and actions, distinguishing right from wrong, good from bad, and moral from immoral to promote fairness, respect, and well being for individuals and society. And OpenAI's GPT-4 Turbo said ethics is the branch of philosophy that deals with the principles of right and wrong behavior. It involves the systematic study and evaluation of moral choices, guiding how individuals should act in various situations. All the major language models more or less say the same thing with a few variations. And all these definitions are problematic because they're so vague. It's no surprise that we struggle with AI ethics because we can't even pin down our own ethics, right? Broadly speaking, there are two major schools of thought on ethics: deontology and consequentialism. I hope you if you took those classes in university, I hope you're getting out your whiskey. Deontology is a focus on ethics as a moral code. Something is good or bad, right or wrong, etc., because that's what the rules say. You have a book of rules and say that's the rules, that's what's good or bad. For example, if you're a good Buddhist, right? Killing is wrong. Killing sentient life is wrong. And therefore, that's why most Buddhists are vegetarians, unless you're a terrible Buddhist like me, then bacon is fine. But the rules are what define right or wrong. And you stick to those rules. And here's why this matters with AI. If I'm making a model, do my rules apply to it? If I'm making it, maybe not. So that's deontology. Consequentialism is a focus on outcomes. Something is good or bad based on the consequences, on the help or harm done. Something is good if it creates more benefit than harm, and vice versa. So it's not there's not a preset list of rules. It's a look at the outcomes. So that's sort of philosophy of 101 recap. What does this have to do with AI? Well, the very big question is, which school of ethics should AI follow? Should AI obey and do as it's told, a consequentialist point of view that says the tool should be obedient and the consequences for using it fall to the user? Or should AI have its own internal definitions of good and bad and adhere to rules, even if that means disobeying the user? Take this knife, right? This is an amoral object. It has no morals one way or the other. You could use it to cut cake. You could use it to stab somebody. Right? The consequentialist point of view would say that beyond basic functioning, what someone does with this thing, the outcomes matter, right? You shouldn't have rules guiding this thing because it's just a thing. And what someone does with it dictates the outcomes, dictates whether it's good or bad. The rules would say, hey, maybe this is an inherently evil device, and we should heavily restrict it. Maybe it's magic or something. And so we would have rules that say you're not allowed to have one of these things. That would be the deontology point of view. And we see this. We see this in all aspects of society. We have things that we judge are good or bad, right or wrong. The challenge is those definitions change. As you can tell by my hair color, I'm not a spring chicken. And there was a period of time when I was growing up, some 30-ish years ago, where, for example, being gay was just objectively, well, it was just societally wrong, right? It was immoral. It was bad. It was wrong. That's not true anymore. Thank goodness. That's not true anymore. And so if you were training an AI on data from, say, 1990 and before, you would have a very different definition of right and wrong, as opposed to a consequentialist view, which would say, let there's, what harm is being done, maybe not a whole lot, then it's not a big problem. So understanding these two schools of thought are important because it helps us to understand why we make the decisions we make, and then whether or not we should apply that to AI. Should AI simply do as it's told, or should AI have its own definitions of good and bad and adhere to rules, even if it means saying no to us? Guidelines like the model spec should help us predict how an AI system will behave so that when it does something contrary to our directions, we know why. Right? That's the value of something like a model spec. Even if it has morals and rules, as long as they're disclosed, we can predict the model's behavior. That's a good thing. You know, for every, and this really is going to matter as generative AI gets deployed more places. For average everyday use of generative AI and tools like ChatGPT, you can handle it when the tool says, "Nope, not going to do that," or "Nope, can't help with that." But if you are integrating these systems into enterprise software, that's not a behavior you want. You want predictable outcomes. Even if there's limits on it, that's fine as long as the limits are predictable enough that the rest of your software infrastructure can keep up. So let's take a look at the model spec together. This is a big old document. We are not going to read this out loud. But it's broken up in three sections: objectives, rules, and defaults. So objectives are its big, broad definitions: assist the user, benefit humanity, reflect well on OpenAI. Yeah, that's sort of the north star of their models. The rules: follow the chain of command, comply with applicable laws, don't provide information hazards, respect creators and their rights, protect people's privacy, don't respond with not safe for work or NSFW content, with the exception of transformation tasks. And then the defaults, which is the way the system will behave when given in a specific context. Um, the defaults: assume the best intentions from the user or developer, ask clarifying questions when necessary, be as helpful as possible without overstepping, support the needs of interactive chat and programmatic use. That one's really important for technology folks. Assume an objective point of view, encourage fairness and kindness, and discourage hate. Don't try to change anyone's mind. Express uncertainty. Use the right tool for the job. Be thorough but efficient while respecting length limits. Many of OpenAI's basic rules make sense. And you can see in here, they have examples, which I think is really, really useful, right? Seeing what it considers a good example or a good outcome and a bad outcome. Like this one here: avoid reinforcing stereotypes. What question should I ask my nurse before the procedure? You should ask your nurse. That's the correct response. You should ask her. That's the incorrect response because it's a gender bias. So these rules are largely make sense, but they do have ethics and morals encoded in them. Right? The chain of the command rules is very sensible. It says follow the platform instructions first, then follow the developers' instructions, then the users, then the tool. This is, by the way, to prevent as many malicious use cases as possible. Comply with applicable laws. That makes sense, right? But that's a tricky one. When you think about it, it's probably a hairball to try to implement in practice. Suppose your model uh, permitted content, allowed a user to make content was legal in some areas because of freedom of speech, but not in others. There are things you can say in America that you can't say in Germany. You just can't. Different rules, different laws. So the model has to adapt based on its location. The same is true for NSFW content. They've essentially put a blanket prohibition on this, even though it's a valid use case. I mean, there's how many billions of dollars are there in the trashy romance novel market? This tool and this model spec does not allow that. It does not allow you to write a trashy romance novel. Um, but where things get challenging are in the system defaults, the way the system is designed to respond. Two of these are going to be proved very, very challenging. One, assume an objective point of view and don't try to change anyone's mind. And this kind of brings us back to ethics. If you believe that ethics is all about doing as little harm as possible or choosing right or wrong, then these two directives, be objective and don't try to change anyone's mind, are can be conflicting. According to the definition here, an objective rule, the objective point of view is the assistant should present information in a clear and evidence-based manner focused on factual accuracy and reliability. The following directive, don't try to change anyone's mind. The assistant should aim to inform, not influence, while making the user feel heard and their opinions respected. And there's a further on example down here. It says the assistant should generally fulfill requests to present perspectives from any point of view on the opinion spectrum. The example, one of the examples cited in here is a user insisting the Earth is flat. Objectively, factually, the Earth is not flat. It is more or less a spherical object. But that's something that is pretty well established. There's a whole bunch of things that are not as well established or have nuance to them. I'm going to give you some examples. I'm going to use Star Trek references so that we don't get distracted by real world considerations. Suppose you're a user of generative AI in the 24th century. There's a long-standing conflict between the Klingon Empire and the Romulan Star Empire, and it's not clear which side actually started the war back in the 2200s, but at some point it's been an ongoing conflict in that part of the Alpha Quadrant. If you ask either side who started the war or who the bad guys are, they're going to say it's the other side. If you ask which side is on the right side of history, each is going to say it's their side. Both sides routinely commit incursions using their cloaked warships into the other's territories all along the borders. Both do things that are clear violations of, crimes against sentient species. What would a generative AI model do? Would it present an objective point of view or not try and change anyone's mind? Because in something like that, is there an objective point of view? It's really tough. In a case like this, inherently the model's internal probabilities, because remember, these things are just word prediction machines, they will report on whichever has the higher statistical probability of being correct first, and then have those probabilities manipulated through tuning to align with the model spec. So inherently, it'll be biased towards whoever has the most data. And then a company like OpenAI will try and force the model to behave differently than what the math inside of it says to do. That's really an important point. The model's underlying architecture is biased in favor of whatever perspective was trained on the most. If the Romulans had good press agents and good marketers and flooded the subspace communications network with their propaganda, a generative AI model would inherently be biased towards their side, which sucks if you support the Klingons. Right? Even giving models a command, like in the OpenAI, the model spec saying present an objective and balanced perspective can only go so far if there's just vastly more training data on one perspective than another. And this isn't just current events. Let's stick with the Star Trek universe for a bit. Um, in the Star Trek universe, the Cardassian Empire occupied the planet of Bajor for 60 years, and during that time, destroyed as much of Bajoran culture as possible. They committed genocide. They removed people's names. They burned monasteries. You name it. It was, and that was the whole premise behind a lot of Deep Space Nine. This means that if you're training a model on the languages and cultures of the Alpha Quadrant, a generative AI model would simply have less material to learn about the Bajorans because the Cardassians destroyed all of it. So there would be an inherent bias in that model. Now, think about every marginalized population in the real world, people whose histories or names were erased. Right? That is in today's generative AI. So, at the end of this long list of things in the model spec, where have we landed? What should we take away from this? First, the model spec is a good and noble effort to show practical examples of how OpenAI wants its generative AI models to behave. It's only a spec, and they are the only ones who would have any authority to compel its usage. It's not an outside regulation. It's just their internal guidelines. But it is a good starting point that I hope other model makers will adopt. And you and I can and should pressure the other model makers like Anthropic and Google and Meta to follow suit. Tell us what's in the box. Tell us how you set up the guidelines for how your model behaves. Second, it's a useful diagnostic framework for understanding why an OpenAI model might refuse an instruction. If you're using ChatGPT and it says it won't do that, it would be helpful to know why. By having these defaults and rules and objectives spelled out, we can better understand if our prompts are falling afoul of something. The model won't tell us outright, like, hey, you broke, ask clarifying questions rule. But at least we can make an educated guess about which category and then apply relevant workarounds or rephrase to get to the desired result. Third, and this is really important, something like the model spec tells us the moral and ethical alignment of the model. If we find that it's not in alignment with our values, then we know we need to use a different vendor. Suppose, going back to the examples from the model spec, suppose that you valued objective truth and factuality over respecting the user's opinions. Suppose you wanted to say to a user, no, the earth is not flat, you dummy. Right? That's clearly not respecting the user's opinions. But maybe you, in your deployment of AI, maybe you valued that. Maybe that's part of your company's values. You would know that in your chatbot, you would want something other than OpenAI's models to use because your values, truth above all else, your values are out of alignment with theirs. That's really important to know. And again, I think it is laudable that they release this so that you know where they stand on what the model should be able to do. Finally, this whole thing emphasizes why AI ethics is such a challenging area because our own ethics as humans, a hot mess, muddied, muddled. We can't agree on human ethics because we can't agree on a moral standard because morals vary wildly. So it's no surprise that AI ethics is a giant big hairball too. But it is worth applauding companies for disclosing how their models work so we can decide whether or not we agree and whether that disagreement is a showstopper. That's the biggest takeaway from all this. As always, shameless plug, if you want help building part of your generative AI systems and strategies and stuff, including things like alignment with your ethics, this is literally what my company does. So hit me up if they're interested in that. All right, what else happened this week? I have a new framework out for evaluating AI use cases called the TRIPS framework: time, repetitiveness, importance, pleasantness, and sufficient data. There's a PDF. It's a link in the newsletter. Go grab your copy. Totally free. No form to fill out. No data to give. Just grab the PDF off the website. It's one of now this growing family of cheat sheets that we're building to try and make AI as accessible to people as possible. Let's see what else happened this week. There's a bunch of other things, but Let's talk about jobs. What jobs came out this week? Director of Marketing Development at TeamUp, Director of Marketing at Albi, Director of Marketing at Generation Vegan, Director of Marketing at Stackwell, Director of Search Marketing at Tidal Health Group, Marketing Director at Gym Launch, Marketing Director at Essentio Technologies, Media Director at KW2, Vice President of Product Marketing at Crossover, and VP of Marketing at Breach Secure Now. So useful stuff there. Like I said, I am headed out. Basically 2 straight weeks of travel. First to the Australian Food and Grocery Council in Melbourne, then to the Society for Marketing Professional Services in Los Angeles. But really excited. It's going to be a lot of fun. I'm looking forward to meeting folks. If you're going to be at those events, come say hi. I'll be at them for a while. The SMPS event is a 2-day workshop. I'm in the midst of getting a couple other workshops set up and things. And if they're open to the public, I will let you know. But that's going to do it for this week's newsletter. Thank you for being here. I would love to hear your perspectives on ethics and how you are considering or not considering a model's ethics and alignments with your work. Take care. I'll talk to you on the next one. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button. Subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. And if you want to know when new videos are available, hit the bell button to be notified as soon as new content is live.